On the evening of the 2nd of May, 2025, Prince Harry sat in a room in London and told a BBC camera that he could not imagine bringing his wife and children back to Britain safely. He was 40 years old. He was in a dark suit. He had spent the morning at the Royal Courts of Justice on the Strand, where three judges confirmed that his police protection in the country of his birth would no longer be automatic, assessed now, case by case, by a government committee he could not influence. His father, the king, was 9 miles away at Buckingham Palace. They had not spoken. That afternoon, the palace released a single sentence. The issues had been examined repeatedly and meticulously by the courts. No mention of family, no mention of the grandchildren the king had barely seen. A prince telling the nation he could not bring his children home, and the crown answering with a line of administrative prose. The House of Windsor has always looked, from the outside, like the most enduring family in public life. The balcony photographs, the Christmas broadcasts, the weddings watched by billions. What the public rarely sees is the machinery beneath, the system that decides who belongs inside the working core and what happens to the ones who are moved outside it. This is the story of how that machinery was turned on the king's own son, a story that reaches back to a signed abdication in 1936, moves through two deaths that reshaped everything, a marriage the institution could not absorb, and a 5-year unraveling in which a prince lost his duties, his patronages, his military titles, his residence, his security, and his access to his own father without anyone ever having to raise their voice. But to understand how a prince of the blood came to stand outside a London courtroom in the spring of 2025, arguing not for inheritance or title, but for something as elemental as the right to bring his children safely home. You have to go back much further than California, further than the interview, further than the wedding. You have to go back to the place where the House of Windsor first learned the lesson it would never forget, that the monarchy survives not by holding its family together, but by deciding which parts of the family it can afford to let go. This is the story of a dynasty that perfected the art of institutional contraction, a family that learned across nearly a century how to narrow itself around the sovereign and the heir, and what that narrowing cost every person it leaves outside the circle. It is a story about a king who cannot be only a father, and a prince who refuses to be only a symbol, and the ancient machinery that will not permit them both to be right. To find the source code for everything that follows, begin on the 10th of December 1936, inside Fort Belvedere, a castellated grace-and-favour house set among the trees at the southern edge of Windsor Great Park. Edward, King of England, Emperor of India, defender of the faith, sat at a writing desk and signed the instrument of abdication. His three brothers stood around him: the Duke of York, who within 24 hours would become George VI, the Duke of Gloucester, the Duke of Kent. The document was of fewer than 200 words. It did not explain why Edward had chosen Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee, over the throne. It did not need to. The constitutional machinery cared only that the sovereign had chosen, and Parliament gave the choice legal effect with the His Majesty's Declaration of Abdication Act the following day. The crown passed to the Duke of York. Edward became the Duke of Windsor, a title that sounded like an honor but functioned as a reclassification. He was no longer the center. He was something the family would spend the rest of the century learning to manage, a former insider whose private choices had made him institutionally inconvenient. There is something about that December morning worth sitting with for a moment. The monarchy did not collapse. It did not rage. It contracted. It tightened itself around the new sovereign, rebuilt its public credibility on George II's quieter virtues: duty, steadiness, visible devotion to his wife and two daughters, and treated Edward not as a traitor, but as an absence. He moved first to Austria, then to France. He married Wallis in June 1937 at the Château de Conde in the Loire Valley. No member of the royal family attended the wedding. He lived the remaining 36 years of his life largely abroad, largely in Paris, largely outside the working life of the institution he had once led. He kept his title, he kept his bloodline, he kept technically his place in the constitutional architecture, though any children he might have had were excluded from the succession by the terms of the abdication. What he lost was belonging. The practical, daily, operational belonging That made the title meaningful. The palace did not need to banish him with a proclamation. It simply carried on without him. And the carrying on was the banishment, that was the template. And it would prove far more durable than anyone involved could have foreseen, because it worked. George VI steadied the institution through the war, through the Blitz, through 6 years of visible, uncomplaining presence at the symbolic center of national life. When he died in February 1952, exhausted and ill at 56, the crown passed to his elder daughter, and the template went with it. Elizabeth Alexandra Mary was 10 years old when her uncle abdicated and her father was thrust onto the throne. She had watched, at an age when such things imprint permanently, the family absorb a crisis by reorganizing itself around duty and discipline. By the time she became queen at 25, the lesson of 1936 was not something she had been taught. It was something she had lived. The monarchy survives by preserving the line of succession, reducing ambiguity about who represents the crown, and keeping the sovereign above the mess of individual personality. Private feelings exist. Private feelings matter. But private feelings must never, under any circumstances, become a threat to the institution's public coherence. Elizabeth II would reign for 70 years, and across every decade that principle held. It held through her sister Margaret's anguished attachment to group captain Peter Townsend in the 50s, when the Church of England's position on divorce made the relationship constitutionally impossible, and Margaret chose duty over love. It held through the long public disintegration of Charles and Diana's marriage in the 80s and 90s. It held through the shattering week after Diana's death in 1997, when the monarchy's failure to perform public grief fast enough nearly tore its relationship with the country apart. Each crisis tested the system. Each crisis confirmed the operating logic. Contract, recalibrate, survive. The institution bent, adapted, modernized its tone. The structural instinct never changed. Into that system, refined by abdication, hardened by war, embodied by a queen whose composure became the institution's public face, Charles Philip Arthur George was born on the 14th of November, 1948, at Buckingham Palace. He was heir from the moment his mother became queen. He was 3 years old. What that means, in practical terms, is that Charles did not grow up inside a normal family. He grew up inside a machine designed to produce a sovereign. His childhood was supervised, structured, and oriented toward the throne from an age before he could understand what the throne required. His father, Prince Philip, favored toughness and self-reliance. His mother, already queen, was constitutionally incapable of being only a mother. Her diary, her duties, the red boxes of state papers, the apparatus of sovereignty consumed the space where a more ordinary parent might have been simply present. Charles was sent to Cheam Preparatory School at 8, then to Gordonstown at 13. His father's old school in the Scottish Highlands, a place built on cold showers, physical endurance, and the suppression of emotional softness. He was miserable there. He has said so himself in interviews and in private correspondence that later entered the public record. He found warmth instead in music and painting in the company of his great-uncle Lord Mountbatten, and in a rich inner life that the institution had no particular use for. He went on to Trinity College, Cambridge, then the Royal Navy, then the long decades of waiting that defined the modern Prince of Wales. Patron, campaigner, organic farmer, architectural critic, a man with strong opinions and no constitutional authority to implement them. The emotional consequence of that formation is central to everything that follows. Charles was, by every account, a sensitive and intellectually restless man, raised inside a structure that prized restraint above expression. He could feel deeply about architecture, about the natural environment, about the spiritual dimensions of public service. He painted watercolors. He talked to plants and was mocked for it and kept talking to them. He wrote long, earnest letters to government ministers about planning policy and organic farming that became known as the Black Spider Memos when they were eventually published. He was capable of genuine warmth in private, of emotional generosity with people he trusted, of a tenderness that those who knew him well described as entirely real. But he could not always show those qualities within the grammar the institution demanded. The system required composure. The system required that a Prince of Wales conduct himself as a sovereign in waiting, not as a man with feelings about what the job was costing him. That tension between emotional literacy and institutional discipline would define his relationships with both of his sons, and it would define decades later his capacity to respond when one of those sons began to pull away. Because by the time Charles became king in September 2022, at the age of 73, the longest apprenticeship in British constitutional history had formed him into something the system needed and something his younger son could not quite reach. A man who had learned, painfully and over decades, that the crown's survival mattered more than any single relationship inside the family. Whether he felt that conviction in his heart or merely performed it in his role is a question the story cannot definitively answer. But the effect was the same. As sovereign, Charles became the guardian of the very logic that was pushing Harry out. He was no longer merely a father who disagreed with his son's choices. He was the embodiment of the institution that could not afford to make exceptions. The two roles, father and king, had always coexisted uneasily in the House of Windsor. In Charles, they would prove irreconcilable. The financial architecture matters here because it is the architecture that converts family feeling into administrative fact. The sovereign's official life is funded publicly through the sovereign grant, calculated as a percentage of the Crown Estate's revenue. In the financial year ending March 2020, that figure was £82.4 million. The heir's official life is funded through the Duchy of Cornwall, a private estate established in 1337 that holds roughly £1 billion in assets and generates tens of millions annually. Working royals, those who carry out official duties on behalf of the sovereign, receive support from these structures: offices, staff, travel, residences, security. Non-working royals do not. The distinction sounds bureaucratic. It is the hinge on which the entire Harry story turns. A royal who steps outside the working corps does not merely lose a job description. They lose the financial, logistical, and security infrastructure that makes royal life operationally possible. They keep the bloodline, they keep the title, they lose the machinery. The royal household's own financial summary for 2019 to 2020 recorded that Charles, then Prince of Wales, met the official expenditure of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex only until the 31st of March, 2020. That date matters. It is the moment when abstract family rupture became a line item in an annual report. On the 29th of July, 1981, Charles married Lady Diana Spencer at St. Paul's Cathedral. 750 million people watched the broadcast. Diana was 20 years old, the daughter of the 8th Earl Spencer, aristocratic but not royal, beautiful in the way the institution needed, photogenic, warm, apparently biddable. What the cameras could not capture was the mismatch at the center. Charles was 32, emotionally formed by decades inside the machine, already in love with Camilla Parker Bowles, and entering a marriage that the institution required, but his heart had not freely chosen. Diana entered a family that still operated by codes nobody explained to outsiders: the hierarchy of deference, the management of press, the unwritten understanding that personal unhappiness was never, under any circumstances, to become a public problem. That dissonance between what Diana expected from a marriage and what the institution expected from a princess would define the next 15 years. It would produce two sons, reshape public expectations of the monarchy, and end in a catastrophe that would mark the younger of those boys for the rest of his life. But in the summer of 81, none of that was yet visible. The system looked magnificent. William Arthur Philip Louis was born on the 21st of June, 1982, at the Lindo wing of St. Mary's Hospital, Paddington. Henry Charles Albert David, Harry, followed on the 15th of September, 1984, at the same hospital. They were not simply brothers. They were born into different constitutional destinies, and the institution understood the difference even if the boys could not yet feel it. William was the future sovereign's future sovereign. The direct line the whole architecture existed to protect. Harry was the spare, essential as emotional insurance, secondary as constitutional fact. That word would become the title of Harry's memoir 4 decades later, and it would land with such force precisely because it named something the family had always known but never said aloud. William's life was pointed from birth toward the throne. Harry's life was pointed toward something the institution had never clearly defined. The role of a prince who matters enough to be visible, but not enough to be indispensable. Diana's presence in both boys' lives was transformative. She was tactile where the institution was formal, emotionally open where the palace was coded, instinctively protective in a way that put her at direct odds with the system's preference for managed exposure. She took William and Harry to homeless shelters and AIDS wards. She broke royal protocol to crouch at eye level with sick children. She showed her sons a world outside the gilded perimeter. She also, as her marriage to Charles disintegrated through the late 80s and into the 90s, drew both boys into an emotional reality the palace was not equipped to handle. A reality of competing loyalties, of pain expressed where the institution demanded silence, of public warfare conducted through carefully placed newspaper stories and competing media strategies. Charles and Diana separated in December 1992. They divorced in August 1996. Harry was 8 when they separated, 12 when the decree absolute came through. And then came the 31st of August, 1997. Diana died in a car crash in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris, pursued by photographers on motorbikes, in the back of a Mercedes driven too fast by a man who had been drinking. She was 36 years old. Dodi Fayed, the man she had been seeing that summer, died with her. The bodyguard Trevor Rees-Jones survived with devastating injuries. Harry was 12 years old. He was at Balmoral, the royal family's estate in the Scottish Highlands, when the news came. William was 15. Their father told them, "The details of that conversation have never been fully disclosed, and they do not need to be. What matters is that a 12-year-old boy, already steeped in the knowledge that his parents' marriage had been a public war, was told that his mother was dead, and that the death was tangled in exactly the forces he had been raised to fear. Cameras, speed, pursuit, the relentless machinery of public fascination, with a woman who had tried and failed to find privacy inside one of the most watched families on earth." 6 days later, on the 6th of September, Harry walked behind his mother's coffin through the streets of London, from Kensington Palace to Westminster Abbey. He was flanked by his father, his brother, his grandfather Prince Philip, and Diana's brother Earl Spencer. The route was lined with crowds. The silence was immense. He was a child performing public grief inside a system that had taught him nothing about how to grieve in private. He would say years later that he barely remembers the walk, that his body was present, but his mind was somewhere else entirely. That dissociation, the gap between what the institution required of him and what his 12-year-old psyche could process, is the foundational crack in his relationship with the monarchy. He complied. He walked. He stood still in the right places and looked down at the right moments. But something inside him registered that the institution had put a child in front of cameras at the worst moment of his life, because the public narrative demanded it and that registration never faded. The death is not backstory. It is the active ghost in every decision Harry would make as an adult. It gave him his deepest fear, that the royal institution could fail to protect the people inside it, and that media frenzy could become not merely intrusive, but lethal. It gave him his lifelong suspicion of the press and his visceral conviction that physical safety and institutional belonging were not the same thing, that the palace could surround you with ceremony and still leave you fatally exposed. Every conflict that follows between Harry and the institution carries the frequency of that August morning. The security litigation of 2025, the argument about whether his wife and children can safely visit Britain, the accusation that his father will not speak to him. All of it vibrates with the original wound. He is not arguing about protection officers and threat assessment matrices. He is arguing about whether the system that could not save Diana will protect him. William processed the same catastrophe differently. He was 15, old enough to begin channeling grief into the discipline the institution demanded, old enough to understand, even at that age, that his future required him to work within the system rather than against it. He went to Eton, then St. Andrews, then Sandhurst. He married a woman who had been vetted over a decade of patience. He produced heirs. He accepted the architecture. The brothers were bound by the most devastating shared experience imaginable, but their responses to it would diverge along the lines the institution had already drawn. William moved closer to the center. Harry moved year by year toward the edges. There's something else about Harry that must be understood before the story can continue. He was extraordinarily good at being royal in precisely the ways the modern monarchy needed. The teenage years were rocky. The Nazi costume at a fancy dress party in 2005, the tabloid coverage, the sense of a young man flailing inside a role he had not chosen. But the military transformed him. He trained at Sandhurst, commissioned into the Blues and Royals, and deployed to Helmand Province in Afghanistan in 2007. That first tour was cut short after 10 weeks when an Australian magazine broke the news blackout on his presence, and the withdrawal stung. It confirmed again that media exposure could make even a combat zone unsafe. But he went back. His second deployment in 2012 was a full tour as an Apache helicopter co-pilot and gunner. He flew missions. He saw combat. He came home with a credibility that had nothing to do with birth or title. The soldiers who served alongside him spoke of a man who wanted to be treated as ordinary and who, for the duration of that deployment, almost was. He founded the Invictus Games in 2014, an international multi-sport event for wounded, injured, and sick servicemen and women, and it became the most effective piece of original public communication any royal of his generation had produced. It was his, not the institution's, not his father's, not his brother's. It channeled his own experience of military life, his own understanding of trauma, and his own instinct that vulnerability, shown honestly, was more powerful than the royal mask of composure. He was not merely liked by the public, he was valued. The family member who could make the monarchy feel human. The walkabouts, the easy laughter with children, the willingness to talk about his own mental health struggles, these were not polished public relations. They were temperament. Harry was emotionally immediate in a way that William, trained from birth for the sovereign's necessary distance, could not afford to be. That quality made Harry essential to the brand and irrelevant to the constitutional line. The tension between those two facts, essential and irrelevant, beloved and expendable, is the structural tragedy of his position. Meghan Markle entered Harry's life in 2016, introduced by most accounts through a mutual friend over drinks in London. She was American, biracial, 35 years old, a successful actress best known for the legal drama Suits. A woman who had built her own career, her own platform, and her own identity long before she ever heard of Kensington Palace. She brought to the relationship a directness, an expectation of personal agency, and a fluency in modern media that were entirely foreign to the royal grammar. She was not from the aristocratic gene pool that had supplied royal brides for generations. She did not arrive with an instinctive understanding of the deference hierarchy, the coded press strategies, or the tacit expectation that a royal spouse's personality should be legible, but never louder than the institution. What she brought instead was a mirror. Harry saw the institution through her experience inside it, and what he saw confirmed every fear Diana's death had planted. The racial abuse directed at Meghan online and in parts of the tabloid press was persistent and undeniable. Harry's November 2016 statement, an unprecedented public communication from a royal condemning the media's treatment of his girlfriend, was the first visible sign that his protective instinct and the palace's media management instincts were no longer aligned. Catherine Middleton, by contrast, had entered William's orbit more than a decade earlier as a student at the University of St. Andrews and had navigated the royal world with a patience and discretion the institution recognized as compatible. She waded through years of courtship, through a public breakup and reconciliation, through a press scrutiny that was intense but never carried the racial dimension Meghan would face. When she married William at Westminster Abbey in April 2011, she did so as someone the system had already vetted across nearly 10 years. Catherine's role in this story is not antagonism. It is structural contrast. She represents the model that works within the monarchy's preferred tempo: gradual assimilation, visible service, emotional restraint, family continuity focused entirely on the line of succession. As Princess of Wales and mother to George, Charlotte, and Louis, the next three people who will matter most to the institution, she makes the future look self contained. The direct line does not need Harry. That constitutional reality is the quietest and most devastating force in the entire narrative. Camilla, now queen, matters not for what she does publicly in the frame of the Harry story, but for what her presence represents in the deeper architecture of the family. She is the woman Charles loved before Diana, during Diana, and after Diana. Her elevation, from the woman publicly blamed for the destruction of a fairy tale marriage to Duchess of Cornwall, to Queen Consort, to, upon Elizabeth's express wish, simply Queen, is the monarchy's own proof that the institution can absorb almost any private complication, provided the person at the center submits to the institution's timeline and its terms. Camilla waited decades. She endured public hostility. She accepted the pace the palace set, and she was eventually folded into the structure so completely that her presence beside Charles on the balcony of Buckingham Palace looks, to a new generation, entirely natural. That model, the patience, deference, institutional absorption, is precisely the model Harry and Meghan would refuse. And hovering behind all of them, holding the whole fragile arrangement together through sheer force of continuity, stood Elizabeth II. She was the last figure with sufficient moral authority to soften the contradictions the family could not resolve on its own. She had navigated 7 decades of family crises without ever letting private feeling override institutional necessity. She was grandmother and sovereign simultaneously, and she managed the tension between those roles with a skill that was so total it appeared effortless. She genuinely loved Harry. Those close to the family have consistently said so. She found him funny, enjoyed his directness, and understood, perhaps better than anyone, the particular burden of being a royal whose constitutional function was never quite defined. Her January 2020 statement, issued after the crisis broke, balanced warmth with boundary in a way that only she could have managed. The family, she said, would have preferred the Sussexes to remain full-time working royals, but they respected and understood their wish to live a more independent life. That single sentence held together family affection and institutional non-negotiable, and it was the last time anyone in the family managed to do both at once. That skill, the ability to say we love you and the rules still apply in the same breath, was the hidden load-bearing wall of the modern monarchy. When she died in September 2022 at the age of 96, that wall came down, and everything it had been quietly supporting, including the last informal channels between Charles and Harry, was exposed to the full structural weight of institutional logic operating without the softening presence of the one person both sides trusted. The wedding at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, on the 19th of May, 2018, was the last moment when it all appeared to hold together. A Black American bishop delivered the address. A gospel choir sang Stand By Me inside a medieval stone chapel. Meghan walked herself partway down the aisle. The guest list mixed Hollywood names with hereditary peerage. An estimated 1.9 billion people watched the broadcast worldwide. It was staged, and it genuinely felt like proof that the modern monarchy had solved its own continuity problem. William and Catherine anchored the constitutional future. Harry and Meghan made the brand younger, more international, more emotionally fluent. Two glamorous couples, two complementary roles, one institution refreshed without being threatened. But the geometry was already unforgiving, and two households of that visibility could not coexist indefinitely in equilibrium. Only one couple sat at the constitutional center. The Sussexes were housed at Frogmore Cottage on the Windsor estate, close to the family, but not at the core. Their charitable ambitions were expansive, but their institutional authority was derivative. Harry's popularity was personal and emotional. William's was positional and constitutional. Meghan's instincts were expressive and outward-facing. The palace's instincts were managerial and inward-facing. The press, always the accelerant in these stories, was already sharpening the contrast between the two couples into a rivalry narrative the institution had no mechanism to diffuse. Staff tensions surfaced. Competing briefings reached journalists. The Kensington Palace household was formally divided into two separate operations, one for the Cambridges, one for the Sussexes. The machinery of fracture was assembling itself behind the public facade of unity, and the people closest to it could feel the structure shifting beneath them. That fragile equilibrium would hold for 18 months after the wedding. And then, on the 8th of January, 2020, it shattered. Buckingham Palace issued a statement confirming that discussions with the Duke and Duchess of Sussex were at an early stage, that the issues were complicated, and that it would take time to work through them. What the careful language concealed was that Harry and Meghan had already decided. They wanted to step back from their roles as senior working members of the royal family. They wanted to build a financially independent life. They wanted to keep their royal titles, their place in the line of succession, and some version of their connection to the institution, while operating outside the framework that gave those things practical meaning. In the language of the monarchy, they were asking for something that had never existed and that the system's deepest logic could not accommodate: a stable version of half belonging, a prince who was both inside and outside, a role that carried the prestige of the crown and the freedom of private life. The House of Windsor had faced a version of that question once before, in December 1936, and the answer had been unambiguous. The institution survived by contracting around the center and letting the periphery go. What remained to be seen, as the January darkness settled over Sandringham and the family gathered for what the press would call a crisis summit, was whether the 21st century version of that answer would look any different, or whether the operating system that had absorbed the abdication, survived the war, outlasted Diana, and buried a queen would simply do what it had always done: preserve the line, reduce the ambiguity, and carry on. If this story has you as captivated as I think it has, do subscribe. What happened next to this family is something the public never knew. And we're only just beginning. The family that gathered at Sandringham in January 2020 had only 18 months earlier looked like the most successful version of itself in a generation. That is the part of the story that needs to be understood before the settlement can be felt, not merely as a constitutional adjustment, but as the end of something that had been briefly and genuinely working. Between the wedding in May 2018 and the crisis of January 2020, the Sussexes had become the most globally visible members of the royal family after the Queen herself. Their first major overseas tour, a 16-day visit to Australia, Fiji, Tonga, and New Zealand in October 2018, timed to coincide with the Invictus Games in Sydney, was a triumph of the kind the monarchy depends on, but rarely achieves with such ease. Harry and Meghan drew crowds that rivaled the early tours of Charles and Diana in the 80s. The photographs were extraordinary. Meghan in Fiji, barefoot at a formal welcome, breaking protocol with the naturalness that made her either thrilling or threatening, depending on whom you asked. Harry crouching with Invictus athletes in Sydney, holding eye contact, listening with the focused tenderness that was his particular gift. The couple in the rain at Victoria Park in Dubbo, sharing an umbrella, visibly in love and visibly effective. Meghan was pregnant. The announcement had been made just before the tour began, at a reception at Admiralty House. Everything about the optics suggested a family at its strongest. The institution renewed, the next generation arriving, the brand extended to audiences the Windsors had never previously reached. Meghan's biracial identity, her American directness, her comfort with physical warmth. These were assets on a Commonwealth tour in a way they were not always assets in a Kensington Palace briefing room. And the distinction mattered. Back in London, the charitable ambitions were expansive and for a time exciting. The Sussexes were developing plans for what would eventually become the Sussex Royal brand, a foundation focused on community building, mental health, and environmental causes, operating under the umbrella of the Royal Foundation that also housed William and Catherine's charitable work. Harry's Invictus Games continued to grow in profile and in the depth of its impact on the lives of the veterans it served. Meghan was developing patronages in the arts, education, and women's empowerment, including the National Theatre and the Association of Commonwealth Universities. They had moved into Frogmore Cottage on the Windsor estate, a 10-bedroom Grade 2 listed house set in the grounds of Frogmore House, after a reported £2.4 million of publicly funded renovations, a fact that would later become ammunition in the public argument about what the taxpayer owed a couple who wanted independence. The cottage was to be their base, close to the Queen at Windsor Castle, close enough to London for official duties, far enough from Kensington Palace to give them operational autonomy from William and Catherine's household. The choice of Frogmore over Kensington was itself a signal, a desire for distance from the joint operation, a wish for a home that was theirs rather than a set of apartments adjacent to William's. Their son, Archie Harrison Mountbatten Windsor, was born on the 6th of May, 2019, at the Portland Hospital in central London. Harry announced the birth to the press himself, outside the stables at Windsor Castle, unable to suppress a grin that made him look for a moment like nothing more complicated than a new father, overwhelmed by joy. The decision not to give Archie a royal title, or more precisely, the complicated legal reality that as a great-grandchild of the sovereign, Archie was not automatically entitled to one under the letters patent issued by George III in 1917, became yet another flashpoint. The Sussexes would later suggest they had wanted a title for Archie and been denied one. The palace's position was that the couple themselves had chosen not to use the courtesy titles available. The truth, as with so much in this story, lay somewhere in the institutional gray zone, where family preference and constitutional precedent were impossible to disentangle. But the argument itself was a symptom of a deeper illness. The Sussexes were operating inside a system where every decision, the child's name, the child's title, the child's first photograph, passed through institutional filters, and the institution's preferences and the couple's preferences were diverging on almost every front. That was the surface, the tours, the baby, the charitable plans, the house on the Windsor estate. Beneath it, the architecture was fracturing in the ways that the public calendar of smiling appearances could not conceal, and the fractures were structural before they were personal. Two royal households of equivalent glamour and public visibility could not operate inside a single institutional framework without producing friction, and the friction arrived early. The joint Kensington Palace household that had served both couples was formally split in the spring of 2019. The Sussexes established their own office, their own communications team, and their own charitable operation, initially based at Buckingham Palace before the planned move to Windsor. The separation was announced in neutral, managerial language, a natural evolution as the family expanded, a practical response to growing workloads. But practical separations generate their own momentum. Now, once there were two offices, there were two sets of competing priorities, two communication strategies, two calendars vying for press attention. The institutional fabric that had held the cousins' household in loose coordination was gone, and nothing replaced it except the ambient goodwill of a family that was rapidly running out. The press dynamic was vicious and accelerating. There is a particular economy in the British tabloid market that operates as a zero-sum game of royal visibility. If one couple is up, another must be down. Stories about rifts between the duchesses began appearing within months of the wedding, sourced to unnamed courtiers, palace insiders, people close to the situation whose names never appeared in print, but whose briefings shaped the coverage. Whether any single story was accurate mattered less than the cumulative effect. Meghan was cast, in one persistent narrative, as a demanding outsider who had made Catherine cry over a bridesmaid's dress fitting for Princess Charlotte, a claim Harry would later dispute publicly, saying the reverse had been true and that Meghan had been the one left in tears. She was cast, in another strand, as a difficult employer whose staff were leaving in unusual numbers, earning her the tabloid nickname Duchess Difficult. She was cast persistently and with increasing venom in certain outlets as a woman who did not understand how things were done, who wanted too much too fast, who was somehow both too American and too ambitious for the institution she had married into. The racial undertones of some of this coverage were not subtle. References to her exotic heritage, commentary on her family background that would never have been applied to a white British aristocrat, the unmistakable suggestion that she did not belong. Harry, who had watched the tabloid press pursue his mother from marriage to divorce to death, experienced this coverage not as the ordinary friction of public life, but as a pattern he recognized, and a pattern that terrified him. The institutional response made this situation worse in ways that were characteristic rather than exceptional. The monarchy's traditional media strategy relied on strategic passivity. Do not engage with individual stories, maintain long term relationships with editors and royal correspondents, brief selectively through trusted channels, and trust that the institution's credibility would outlast any single news cycle. The system had worked more or less for decades. It worked because the people inside it accepted its tempo. Meghan's instinct was fundamentally different: respond, correct, push back, control the narrative before it calcified into accepted truth. Harry's instinct, sharpened by his mother's fate, was that silence in the face of hostility was not dignified restraint, but institutional abandonment, the system refusing to protect one of its own because protection might inconvenience the broader media relationship. The couple's desire to manage their own press presence put them on a collision course with the palace's communications apparatus, and neither side could back down without surrendering something it considered essential. The palace could not let one household dictate media strategy without undermining the institution's entire approach. The Sussexes could not accept the palace's approach without accepting what felt to them like complicity in their own destruction. By the autumn of 2019, the private war had become a public one. During their tour of southern Africa in September and October, a 10-day visit to South Africa, with a solo trip by Harry to Botswana, Angola, and Malawi, an ITV documentary crew was embedded with the couple and filmed an exchange that broke through every layer of royal composure. The journalist Tom Bradby, who had known Harry for years, asked Meghan a simple question about how she was coping. Her answer was unguarded in a way that no member of the royal family had been unguarded on camera in living memory. She said not many people had asked her if she was all right. She said she had been warned by British friends before the wedding not to marry Harry because the tabloids would destroy her life. She said she had naively dismissed those warnings because she thought it would be fair. And then she paused, visibly close to tears. And the pause said more than any sentence could have. She was a woman telling a global audience that the institution she had married into was failing to protect her. And the emotion on her face was not performed. It was the expression of someone who had reached the limit of what she could absorb in silence. Harry, in a separate segment, was no less revealing. He acknowledged that he and William were on different paths. He said most of the rifts were created out of nothing by the press, but he could not deny that the pressure of the roles had strained the relationship. And then he said something that connected the present crisis to the wound at the center of his life. He said he would not be bullied into playing a game that killed his mother. The word killed landed with the weight of 22 years of unresolved grief. He was not speaking metaphorically. He was saying, in the clearest terms a royal had ever used on camera, that the media environment the palace tolerated had caused Diana's death, and that he feared it would cause further harm. The footage aired on ITV to an audience of millions, and it marked the moment when even casual observers understood that the Sussex situation was not tabloid gossip. The couple were in genuine distress, and the institution was either unable or unwilling to address the source of that distress within its existing structures. Something was going to break. The only question was how publicly. There was a deeper current beneath the staff tensions and the press warfare, and it was constitutional. The Sussexes wanted a model of royal life that the institution had never offered and was not designed to provide. They wanted to be working royals on their own terms, choosing their own projects, generating their own income, building their own global brand, while retaining their royal titles, their place in the line of succession, and some version of official status that distinguished them from mere private citizens. The idea was not irrational. It had a logic, rooted in the reality that a younger son with no path to the throne and a global profile might serve the monarchy better from a position of creative semi-independence than from a position of institutional subordination. Other European monarchies had found versions of this model. The Swedish and Dutch royal houses had members who combined personal careers with occasional official duties. But the British monarchy, shaped by the 1936 abdication and the 7 decades of Elizabeth's reign, was not built for ambiguity. You were either inside the system, on the system's terms, subject to the system's constraints, or you were outside it. There was no third position. Edward VIII had tested that boundary. Princess Margaret had tested it in a different register. The answer had always been the same. The center holds, the periphery adjusts. On the 13th of January 2020, the senior members of the family convened at Sandringham to determine what the adjustment would look like. The Queen, Charles, William, Harry. No spouses present. Meghan remained in Canada, connected by telephone for part of the discussion, though the details of her participation have never been fully disclosed. No advisors in the room for the core conversation, though private secretaries and senior household staff waited in adjacent rooms, ready to be called on points of constitutional and financial detail. The Norfolk estate in January is flat, gray and cold, bare trees, waterlogged fields, the big house set back from its drive, its rooms heated unevenly in the way of large English country houses in winter. It is not a dramatic location in the way Buckingham Palace or Windsor Castle are dramatic. It is a family house, the place the Windsors have gathered for Christmas for decades, and the fact that the crisis summit took place there rather than in an official London residence gave it the texture of a family intervention rather than a constitutional negotiation. But the emotional dynamics inside the room were anything but domestic. Charles was caught between his instincts as a father and his obligations as heir. He would become king within 3 years. And every concession to Harry's desire for a bespoke arrangement would create a precedent the institution would have to live with. William's position was, if anything, harder to articulate publicly, but clearer privately. His brother's semi-detached model threatened the coherence of the institution William was being prepared to lead. If Harry could operate independently, trading on the royal brand while accepting none of its constraints, what did that say about the deal William had spent his entire life accepting? The resentment, if it existed, when multiple accounts suggest it did, was not petty. It was structural. William had submitted to the system. Harry was asking to rewrite its terms. Elizabeth, 83 years into her life and 68 into her reign, held the room together as only she could. But even her authority could not bridge the gap between what Harry wanted and what the institution could offer without compromising its own architecture. Elizabeth's statement 5 days later, on the 18th of January, deserves to be understood in its full precision because it captures the monarchy's method at its most exact. She said the family had had very constructive discussions. She said they were entirely supportive of Harry and Meghan's desire for a new life. She said she would have preferred them to remain full-time working members of the royal family. She said they had made clear they did not want to be dependent on public funds. And she said, "These are complex matters for my family to resolve, and there is some more work to be done, but I have asked for final decisions to be reached in the coming days." Every sentence performed a specific function. The affection was real, the boundaries were absolute, the family loved them, the institution was letting them go. The two sentiments coexisted in the same paragraph without contradiction, because in the Windsor system, they had never been contradictory. Love and institutional logic operate on parallel tracks. The institution does not need to stop loving you in order to reclassify you. It simply needs to determine that your presence in the working core creates more ambiguity than your absence, and then the machinery does the rest. The formal terms, announced that same day, were specific. The Duke and Duchess of Sussex would step back from their roles as senior working members of the royal family. They would no longer use their HRH titles in an official capacity. They would not carry out official duties on behalf of the Queen. They would not receive public funds for royal work. They would repay the £2.4 million of taxpayer money spent on the Frogmore cottage renovation. There would be a 12-month review period after which the arrangement would be assessed. The Sussexes would retain their titles, Duke and Duchess of Sussex, and Harry would remain in the line of succession. In a single announcement, the emotional rupture of the preceding 18 months had been translated into the language of institutional administration: funding withdrawn, duties removed, titles adjusted, review, period scheduled. The feelings that had produced the crisis, Harry's fear, Meghan's suffocation, the family's bewilderment and anger, were nowhere in the text. They did not need to be. The text was the institution's answer, and the institution's answer was structural, not emotional. The physical departure followed, and it was more painful in its specifics than any summary can capture. By March 2020, the Sussexes had completed their final round of official engagements. a rapid sequence of public appearances that had the quality of a farewell tour neither side could openly call one. Harry attended an Invictus Games event. He and Meghan visited the Canada House. They attended the Endeavour Fund Awards together, Meghan in a turquoise dress, Harry in a dark suit. Both of them smiling for the cameras with the practiced composure of people who know the cameras are looking for cracks. The Commonwealth Day service at Westminster Abbey on the 9th of March was, in effect, their last public appearance as working royals, and the Abbey's stone interior, soaring, ancient, designed to make human beings feel small beside the permanence of the institution, provided an unintentional commentary on the occasion. Harry and Meghan were seated separately from William and Catherine. The two couples did not embrace. They barely spoke. The body language was so stiff, so carefully managed, that the absence of natural warmth became its own kind of statement. 17 months earlier, at that same abbey, Meghan had sat beside Catherine at the same service, and the four of them had smiled and chatted and looked to the world like the future of the monarchy working in concert. Now the four of them could not produce even a convincing imitation of family ease. The cameras naturally captured everything. Harry and Meghan left first for Vancouver Island in British Columbia, where they had spent the Christmas period away from Sandringham, a choice that had itself been a signal, a physical departure from the family Christmas that presaged the constitutional one. Then they moved to Los Angeles, arriving in late March as the pandemic began, closing borders around the world. The timing was either fortuitous or suffocating, depending on perspective. The lockdowns meant the move attracted less media frenzy than it might have, but it also meant the Sussexes were isolated in a new country, in a new city, with a toddler, during a global crisis, without the institutional support system they had just relinquished. Then, in the summer of 2020, they settled in Montecito, California, purchasing a 9-bedroom, 16-bathroom estate for a reported $14.7 million. The house sat on 7 acres in a community favored by celebrities and billionaires. Oprah Winfrey was a neighbor, and it was, by any measure, magnificent. But it was not a royal residence. It was not tied to an estate, a duchy, a crown, a national story. It was a private house purchased with private money in a country where the Duke of Sussex was, constitutionally and practically, a private citizen. The Atlantic Ocean was now literal as well as metaphorical. They were 5,000 miles from Buckingham Palace, 8 time zones from the family, and operating in a media and cultural ecosystem that bore no resemblance to the one they had left behind. California offered freedom, warmth, and a celebrity infrastructure that understood Meghan's world. It also offered a particular kind of loneliness. The loneliness of a man who had spent his entire life inside a system and was now, for the first time, entirely outside it. The 12-month review concluded in February 2021, and the result erased whatever ambiguity the original settlement had preserved. Buckingham Palace confirmed that Harry and Meghan would not be returning as working members of the royal family. The statement added, with the institution's characteristic blend of warmth and finality, that they remained much-loved members of the family. But the practical consequences were total, and they fell with the steady, impersonal weight of institutional process. Their honorary military appointments, Harry's roles as Captain General of the Royal Marines, Honorary Air Commandant of RAF Huntington, and Commodore-in-Chief of the Royal Naval Command's Small Ships and Diving, were returned to the Queen for redistribution among working royals. Their royal patronages were likewise returned. The Sussex royal brand was formally closed. They could not use the word royal in their independent ventures. The institution's message, stripped of the diplomatic language it was wrapped in, was clear. You chose to leave, and now the leaving is complete. Each of these losses was procedural in form. Each was personal in substance. The military titles were not decorative ribbons pinned to a prince's lapel for photographs. Harry had served a decade in the army. He had deployed twice to Afghanistan. He had built Invictus on the foundation of that service, on the credibility of a man who had sat in the gunner's seat of an Apache and understood what it meant to come home from a war zone with injuries the public could not see. Losing the Captain General role with the Royal Marines, a title that connected his military identity to his royal one, that made him the formal representative of 32,000 serving Marines, was not administrative housekeeping. It was the severing of the last link between who he had been inside the institution and what the institution was prepared to acknowledge about him from the outside. He reportedly told friends it was the loss that cut deepest. The military had given him purpose when the palace had given him only ambiguity, and now the palace was taking the military connection too. The patronages, the National Theatre, the Association of Commonwealth Universities, the Queen's Commonwealth Trust, the Rugby Football Union, the Rugby Football League, were the mechanisms through which a working royal connects to the civic and cultural life of the nation. Each one represented a relationship with an organization, a cause, a community that looked to the crown for visibility, advocacy, and the particular kind of attention that a royal visit can generate. Without them, a prince is simply a famous person with a title and no operational mandate. The financial separation completed the architecture of departure. No more Duchy of Cornwall funding from Charles. No more sovereign grant contributions. No more official support for official work, because there was no more official work to support. Harry and Meghan would need to generate their own income, and they would through deals with Netflix, Spotify, and a publishing contract that would yield the memoir Spare. But the transition from public servant funded by the nation to private citizen funded by media deals carried its own set of vulnerabilities, and those vulnerabilities would compound as the story continued. Meanwhile, the institution was doing what the institution always does after a contraction, reorganizing itself to fill the space. William and Catherine absorbed an increased workload. Princess Anne, already the hardest working member of the family by number of official engagements, continued at her relentless pace. The Earl and Countess of Wessex, Edward and Sophie, stepped into roles that might once have been shared more broadly. In 2022, Parliament would pass the Councillors of State Act, adding Anne and Edward to the pool of royals who could act on behalf of the sovereign during incapacity or absence abroad. The legislation was practical. It ensured that the councillors were active working royals rather than members who had left the working corps. But it was also symbolic. The institution was building a future that did not depend on Harry's participation. The machinery was routing around him the way a river routes around a stone, not by destroying the obstacle, but by finding the path of least resistance and carrying on. The family did not formally cast Harry out. The institution reclassified him. That distinction is the key to everything that follows, because reclassification is the modern Windsor method. It does not require a confrontation or a villain. It requires only that the bureaucratic machinery, the private secretaries, the Lord Chamberlain's office, the HR functions, the communications teams, the financial controllers, the security coordinators process the change and move on. The monarchy is not a family that happens to have an institution attached. It is an institution that happens to contain a family. And the institution, once it has determined that a member no longer sits inside the working corps, does not need to be hostile. It simply becomes procedural. The forms are filed, the titles are redistributed, the funding is redirected. The family member remains a family member in the emotional sense. They cease to be a functioning component of the machine in every other sense, and the machine keeps running. The question, by the spring of 2021, was whether the Sussexes would accept the reclassification quietly. The monarchy's deep institutional preference, refined across nearly a century of managing departures, was that they would. The system works best when the periphery fades. Edward became the Duke of Windsor and lived in Paris and gave no public testimony about what the family had done to him. Margaret accepted the system's constraints and bore them privately at enormous personal cost. The preferred model was acquiescence, distance, and the long silence of a family member who understands that the institution outlasts the individual. Harry and Meghan chose the opposite. On the 7th of March, 2021, just 12 days after the palace confirmed their permanent departure from the working corps, they sat in the garden of their Montecito home with Oprah Winfrey. The timing was not accidental. The February announcement had closed the institutional door. The interview would blow the walls out. It would be broadcast by CBS on the 7th of March to a live American audience, then aired in the United Kingdom the following evening on ITV. Oprah, one of the most skilled interviewers in the history of American television, a woman who had built an empire on the public confession of private pain, would sit across from the Duchess of Sussex in a garden chair, and Meghan would tell her version of the story. Harry would join partway through, and he would tell his. The era of acquiescence was over. The family's private architecture, the hierarchies, the silences, the coded language, the careful calibrations of what could be said and to whom and through which channels, was about to be narrated in the Sussex's own words to a global audience of nearly 50 million viewers across the two broadcasts in a format the monarchy could not control, could not edit, could not preempt, and could not answer with a palace statement of 3 sentences. The institution that had survived by contracting around the center and letting the periphery go quietly was about to discover what happened when the person it had contracted away decided that silence was no longer something he owed the family that had reclassified him. The rules of engagement were about to change entirely. And the monarchy, for the first time in its modern history, would not be the one controlling the narrative. The interview aired on CBS on the 7th of March, 2021, a Sunday evening in the United States, with the British broadcast following the next night on ITV. Oprah Winfrey sat across from Meghan in the garden of a house in Santa Barbara, not their own Montecito home, but a neutral location arranged for the production, the California sun filtering through the trees, 2 women in chairs on a manicured lawn, the whole aesthetic designed to signal intimacy rather than spectacle. The setup was deceptive in its simplicity. What followed was the most consequential royal interview since Diana sat opposite Martin Bashir in 1995 and told the nation there were 3 people in her marriage. The echo was deliberate. The consequences would be at least as devastating. Meghan spoke first, alone, for the first portion of the interview. She described arriving in the royal family with no preparation for its codes and protocols. She said she had not even known how to curtsy before meeting the Queen and had been given a quick lesson by Fergie in a corridor. She described the isolation of royal life, the loss of autonomy, the feeling of being silenced. She said she had been told she could not go to lunch with friends. She said her passport and keys had been taken from her. She said she had experienced suicidal thoughts during her pregnancy and had asked the institution for help and been told it would not be possible because of how it would look. The disclosure was unflinching. She sat in that garden and told a global audience that the monarchy, the institution her husband had been born into, the institution that had shaped the past 1,000 years of British public life, had driven her to the point where she did not want to be alive, and that when she had asked for help, the institution had prioritized its own image over her survival. Whether every detail was precisely as Meghan described it, or whether the institutional perspective would have rendered the same events differently, the emotional force of the disclosure was undeniable. A woman was saying she had nearly died inside the family, and the family's apparatus had looked the other way. Then came the moment that detonated across every front page on Earth. Meghan told Oprah that during her pregnancy with Archie, there had been conversations within the family, she did not say with whom, about how dark the baby's skin might be, and concerns about what that would mean for the child's appearance and, by implication, for the institution's image. Oprah's face registered the weight of the claim before the audience could process it. Meghan did not name the family member. Harry, when he joined the interview later, confirmed the conversation had taken place, but also declined to identify the person. The allegation that someone inside the royal family had raised the color of an unborn child's skin as a matter of institutional concern landed with a force that transcended tabloid scandal. It connected the Sussexes' personal grievance to a structural question about race, belonging, and who the British monarchy was built to include. The palace's response, issued the following day, was 4 sentences long. It said the issues raised were concerning and would be addressed privately. It said recollections may vary. That final phrase, recollections may vary, was the institution at its most compressed. 3 words that simultaneously acknowledged the seriousness of the claim, cast doubt on its accuracy, and closed the door on any further public engagement. It was a masterpiece of institutional deflection, and it satisfied nobody. Harry's portion of the interview shifted the register from institutional criticism to family grief. He spoke about his father and his brother. He said Charles had stopped taking his calls for a period after the departure. He said his relationship with William was space. a careful word that meant distance without declaring permanent rupture. He described the financial reality. He had been cut off from the Duchy of Cornwall funding in the first quarter of 2020, and the family had initially been living off the inheritance Diana had left him. He spoke about Diana herself, about his fear that history was repeating itself, that the press hostility Meghan faced was the same force that had pursued his mother to her death, and that the institution was failing again to protect the woman he loved. The interview was watched by an estimated 17.1 million viewers on the CBS broadcast alone, with millions more across subsequent airings worldwide. It was translated, excerpted, debated, and dissected in every language and every medium. What had been a royal staffing dispute and a family disagreement was now a global argument about race, mental health, institutional accountability, and the culture of silence inside the House of Windsor. The monarchy's institutional response to the Oprah interview revealed the limits of the strategic passivity that had served it for decades. The four-sentence statement was all the public would get. There would be no point-by-point rebuttal, no competing interview, no detailed counter-narrative. The institution trusted, as it always trusted, the silence and continuity would outlast the news cycle. In the short term, that calculation held. The British public, polled in the weeks after the broadcast, was divided largely along generational lines. Younger viewers tended to sympathize with the Sussexes, older viewers with the institution. The monarchy's approval ratings dipped but did not collapse. William, asked by a reporter during a school visit whether the royal family was racist, said they were very much not a racist family. A rare public response that broke the institutional convention of non-engagement and suggested the claim had reached a nerve that even the most disciplined member of the household could not leave untouched. Catherine, beside him, said nothing. The division of labor was itself revealing. William took the hit publicly because the allegation demanded a human response, not an institutional one, and William was the family member best positioned to give it without conceding ground. But the deeper damage was not to the institution's polling numbers or to its global reputation. It was to the family's internal capacity for reconciliation. Every word the Sussexes had said publicly about Charles refusing to take calls, about William's relationship being reduced to space, about unnamed family members expressing concern over a child's skin color, was now part of the permanent, searchable, globally accessible record. It could not be unsaid. It could not be walked back in a private conversation after being broadcast to 17 million people. It could not be resolved through the family's preferred instrument of reconciliation, which was time and proximity, because there was no proximity and time was making the positions harder, not softer. The Oprah interview did not simply narrate the rupture, it poured concrete into it. The months that followed were a strange interlude of parallel lives, each moving forward according to its own logic, each making the other's position more difficult by the mere fact of existing. In London, the monarchy carried on with the steady, rhythmic efficiency that was its greatest institutional asset. The Queen, despite her declining mobility and health, continued a program of engagements. Virtual audiences, investitures, the ceremonial business of sovereignty conducted from Windsor Castle rather than Buckingham Palace. Charles and Camilla maintained the heirs' calendar with quiet persistence. William and Catherine increased their public visibility significantly, stepping into spaces the Sussexes had once occupied. The mental health advocacy, the youth engagement, the international tours that broadcast the monarchy's relevance to a global audience. The contrast between the disciplined public presence and the Sussexes' Californian candor became, for the institution, a vindication of the model it had always preferred. William never gave an interview about his feelings. Catherine never described her struggles with the press. They showed up, did the work, smiled when the cameras pointed, and went home. Duty, restraint, continuity, the subordination of personal narrative to institutional purpose. The model that Harry had found suffocating was, for William and Catherine, the price of admission to a life they had both accepted on its own terms. In Montecito, Harry and Meghan were building something architecturally different, a media enterprise, a charitable foundation, a commercial identity constructed from the wreckage of the institutional one. They signed deals with Netflix and Spotify, reported to be worth a combined total exceeding $100 million. They launched Archewell, their umbrella foundation, and Archewell Productions, their content company. Meghan developed and hosted a Spotify podcast called Archetypes, exploring stereotypes that hold women back. Harry appeared at public events in the United States, the Super Bowl, charity galas, conferences, and gave interviews and speeches that kept the royal narrative in the public conversation. They were, by any external measure, successfully constructing a post-royal identity. But the construction depended on the very thing they had left behind. The Netflix deal was valuable because Harry was a prince. The Spotify deal existed because Meghan was a duchess. The memoir would sell millions of copies because it was written by a man who had grown up inside Buckingham Palace. The commercial model was parasitic on the institutional connection in a way that neither the institution nor the Sussexes could fully acknowledge. The two worlds, Windsor and Montecito, existed in parallel, connected by the bloodline and by the escalating tension of a family that could neither reconcile nor fully separate, because the separation itself was the product they were both, in different ways, selling. Then, on the 8th of September 2022, Elizabeth II died at Balmoral Castle. She was 96 years old. She had reigned for 70 years and 214 days, the longest reign in British history, a span that encompassed the post-war settlement, decolonization, the Cold War, the digital revolution, and the transformation of Britain from an imperial power to a modern European democracy. Her death had been anticipated for months. She had been visibly frail at the Platinum Jubilee celebrations that summer, appearing on the balcony of Buckingham Palace for minutes rather than the extended presence of previous years. But anticipation did not soften the blow. Charles became King Charles III. The transition was seamless in constitutional terms. The Accession Council met at St. James's Palace the following day. The proclamation was read. The machinery of succession functioned as it had been designed to function for centuries. The country entered a period of national mourning that was vast, emotional, and for many people, surprising in its intensity. Queues to view the lying-in state at Westminster Hall stretched for miles along the Thames embankment, with wait times exceeding 24 hours. The nation grieved not just a monarch, but a fixed point, the person who had been there, unchanging for 70 years, while everything else shifted around her. Harry and Meghan flew to the United Kingdom for the funeral. They had been in the country already on a previously scheduled trip when the Queen's health deteriorated, and they remained for the period of mourning. For 10 days, the family was in the same country, attending the same events, visible together in the rituals of national grief. The optics were managed with the institution's customary precision, and the management was revealing. Harry wore a mourning suit to the funeral at Westminster Abbey, not a military uniform, a distinction that carried its own quiet devastation. Other members of the family in military roles wore their dress uniforms. Harry, whose honorary appointments had been stripped in February 2021, did not have the right to wear the uniform he had earned through a decade of service, including 2 combat deployments. The decision, or the protocol, depending on how one reads it, meant that at his grandmother's funeral, in the most public and solemn setting imaginable, Harry was visually marked as different from the rest of the family. He stood with them. He mourned with them. But he did not look like them. The uniform was not just clothing. It was belonging, made visible in cloth and brass, and its absence was the absence of everything he had lost. Elizabeth's death also marked the removal of the last informal bridge between Harry and the institution. She had been the family member who could call, who could listen, who could say, with the authority of 70 years on the throne, that things would work out, that the family would endure, that love and institutional reality were not incompatible. She had been, in her own quiet way, the person most likely to have brokered some version of peace, because she was the only person both sides trusted without reservation. With her death, Charles became the head of the family as well as the head of state, and the institution would operate under his authority. The informal channels, the grandmother's mediation, the particular blend of warmth and boundary that had softened the first stage of the Sussex departure, all of it was gone. And the institution's logic, unmediated by Elizabeth's personal presence, was about to assert itself with a clarity that left no room for the ambiguity Harry had spent 4 years hoping might still exist. What came next was the compound event that functions as the second fracture in this narrative, because it arrived not as a single blow, but as a sustained barrage across the winter of 2022 into the early weeks of 2023. And by the time it was over, the possibility of private reconciliation had been effectively destroyed. On the 8th of December 2022, Netflix released the first 3 episodes of Harry and Meghan, a 6-part documentary series directed by Liz Garbus. The remaining 3 episodes followed a week later. The timing was deliberate. 3 months after the Queen's funeral, before the grief had fully settled, while the public's emotional investment in the royal family was still running high. The series was, in form, a love story. Their meeting through a mutual friend, the courtship conducted in secret, the proposal over a roast chicken at Nottingham Cottage, their happiness before the institution closed in around them, the media hostility, the decision to leave. In substance, it was an extended prosecution of the institution's failures, told entirely from the Sussexes' perspective, illustrated with home video footage and personal photographs the public had never seen. The two of them cooking together, Harry filming Meghan in the garden, the private life behind the headlines rendered in the intimate, handheld aesthetic of a couple who had been documenting their own experience for years. Friends and allies appeared on camera to support the narrative. Former staff members spoke. The palace was not given a right of reply within the production, and the institution's perspective appeared only through archival news clips that served the Sussexes' framing. The series was watched by tens of millions of viewers across Netflix's global platform. In the United Kingdom, it dominated the cultural conversation for 2 weeks. The production quality was high, the emotional pitch sustained, and the couple's willingness to share private footage gave the series a rawness that traditional royal documentaries, authorized, vetted, institutionally controlled, could never match. Harry spoke about the press with an anger that was clearly undiminished by time. He spoke about his family with the measured grief of a man who understood that every word he said on camera was widening the distance between himself and the people he was describing. Meghan described the protocols, the silence, the feeling of being consumed by an institution that saw her as a function rather than a person. The monarchy's response was, once again, silence, no statement, no counterproduction, no briefing. The institution's strategy remained unchanged. Wait, endure, carry on. But the medium had shifted beneath it. Netflix reached audiences the court circular could not touch, and the Sussexes' version of events, told in their own words, in their own footage to their own audience, was becoming the dominant public narrative, whether or not the institution chose to engage with it. A month later, on the 10th of January 2023, Harry's memoir, Spare, was published by Penguin Random House, and the ground tilted further. Spare was not a gentle reflection on royal life. It was a 416-page account of Harry's childhood, his mother's death, his military service, his relationship with Meghan, and his deteriorating relationship with his father and his brother, written with a specificity and an emotional rawness that no member of the royal family had ever committed to print. The ghostwriter was J.R. Meeringer, a Pulitzer-winning journalist, and the prose carried a directness that felt like Harry's own voice, unpolished, sometimes artless, but never less than candid. He described a physical altercation with William at Nottingham Cottage, a small residence in the grounds of Kensington Palace that Harry had used before moving to Frogmore, in which Harry wrote William had grabbed him by the collar, knocked him to the floor against a dog bowl, and broken it. He described Charles telling him there was not enough money to support the Sussexes financially after their departure. He described being told by his father, as a child, that Charles's blood ran through his veins, a remark that landed, in the context of the memoir, as an invocation of hierarchy rather than love. He wrote about killing Taliban fighters in Afghanistan, describing the number, the 25, and the way he had been trained to think of them as chess pieces rather than people. He wrote about losing his virginity in a field behind a pub. He wrote about using cocaine and cannabis. He wrote about the frost that settled over his relationship with William after the Sussexes' departure, and the way conversations between the brothers had become stiff, coded, and monitored by the institutional apparatus around them. The book sold more than 1.4 million copies on its first day of publication in the United Kingdom, setting a record as the fastest selling nonfiction book in British publishing history. It went to number one in virtually every market where it was released. It was translated into dozens of languages. Extracts were leaked and serialized before publication, ensuring that the most explosive revelations, the fight with William, the skin color conversation, the killing count in Afghanistan, entered the public conversation before readers had access to the fuller context of the narrative. The private life of the royal family, the arguments, the jealousies, the physical confrontation between two princes in a cottage kitchen, was now available in hardback at every bookshop in the country for $14.99. The institutional damage of the Netflix Spare sequence was not primarily reputational. The monarchy's approval ratings absorbed the impact as they had absorbed every impact for the past century: the abdication, the Diana crisis, the Andrew scandal, and emerged diminished but intact. The real damage was relational, and it was of a kind that no institutional mechanism could repair. Every disclosed conversation, every described argument, every private moment rendered in print or on screen made it harder for the family to occupy the same room without the weight of what had been published pressing down on every silence and every glance. Charles could not sit across from Harry without knowing that Harry had told the world his father had said there was not enough money to support him. William could not sit across from Harry without knowing that Harry had described in meticulous physical detail the altercation at Nottingham Cottage, the collar grab, the fall, the broken dog bowl, and that millions of readers now carried that image in their heads. Catherine could not encounter Meghan without the knowledge that the bridesmaid fitting argument had been publicly relitigated in their favor and then publicly contested in the other direction. Every member of the family existed now inside a narrative that had been told about them without their consent and broadcast to the world without their participation. The family's preferred mode of conflict resolution, silence, time, the gradual softening of grievance through proximity and shared duty, was no longer available because there was no proximity and there was no shared duty. And the grievances were not softening. They were hardening into published text and archived footage that would outlive every person involved. Then came Frogmore. In the early months of 2023, reports emerged that King Charles had asked the Sussexes to vacate Frogmore Cottage. A spokesperson confirmed they had been asked to leave the cottage and the 10-bedroom house on the Windsor estate, the residence whose £2.4 million renovation they had repaid in full. The last physical foothold Harry held inside the royal perimeter was to be reassigned as part of what was described as a wider reorganization of royal residences under the new king. Whether the decision was punitive or merely practical depended entirely on perspective and on whether one believed that the timing, weeks after the publication of Spare, was coincidental. The institution offered no public explanation beyond the administrative rationale, but the symbolism required no explanation. The house where Harry and Meghan had hosted their wedding reception in May 2018, the house where they had begun their married life, the house where Archie had spent his first months, the house that had been their nominal UK address even after they moved to California. That house was no longer theirs. Harry had repaid the renovation costs. It did not matter. The residence belonged to the Crown Estate, and the Crown Estate answered to the institution. And the institution had decided the cottage would be put to other use. The last address inside the Windsor perimeter was gone. The accumulation of losses, listed plainly, tells its own story. By the spring of 2023, Harry had lost his senior working royal status, his HRH style in official use, his military appointments, his royal patronages, his Duchy of Cornwall funding, his sovereign grant support, his Frogmore Cottage residence, and the daily proximity to the family and the country that had given all of those things their meaning. What he retained was his title, Duke of Sussex, his place in the line of succession, and his bloodline. He was still a prince. He was still fifth in line to the throne. He was still, constitutionally, a member of the royal family. But the practical infrastructure that once made those facts operational had been dismantled piece by piece through a process that never required a single dramatic confrontation. The institution had not needed to slam a door. It had simply removed the hinges one at a time until the door was no longer a door, By the autumn of 2023, the divergence between the two brothers' lives and the two models of royal existence they represented, grace, was total and apparently irreversible. In London, William and Catherine were more visible and more central than at any point in their public lives. Their children, George 10, Charlotte 8, and Louis 5, appeared at carefully staged public moments that made the line of succession feel not just secure, but warm and self-renewing. William had taken on the Prince of Wales title and the Duchy of Cornwall that came with it, inheriting the financial engine that had once supported his father and briefly his brother. Catherine, whose grace under the unrelenting pressure of public life had become one of the monarchy's most valuable assets, anchored the family's visual identity alongside William in a way that made the institution's future feel coherent. Princess Anne maintained her extraordinary pace of public engagements, over 500 in 2022 alone. The Countess of Edinburgh, Sophie, stepped into roles with quiet competence. The working royal corps was tighter, smaller, and more focused than it had been in a generation, and the absence of the Sussexes was, in operational terms, no longer a wound. It was a reorganization. The institution had routed around the disruption and found a configuration that worked. In Montecito, the picture was more complicated and less stable. Harry and Meghan were wealthy, famous, and free from the protocols, the hierarchy, the institutional filters that had made their royal life untenable. But freedom from the institution had not delivered the peace they had been seeking. The Spotify deal, once heralded as proof of their commercial viability, ended in June 2023 after producing only one season of Meghan's podcast Archetypes. The parting was publicly awkward, with unnamed Spotify executives reportedly describing the Sussexes as grifters. Such a characterization that wounded precisely because it articulated the criticism that had followed them since the departure. That the commercial model depended on monetizing the very connection they had severed. The Netflix deal continued, but the content pipeline beyond the initial documentary was uncertain. The commercial architecture that was supposed to replace the institutional one was proving structurally fragile, and the fragility exposed the central paradox of Harry's post-royal life. The asset that made him commercially valuable was his proximity to the crown, and every month in Montecito moved him further from that proximity. Harry remained a global figure, but his public identity was increasingly defined not by what he was building, but by what he had lost and by the legal battles he was still fighting. He was free. He was also in a way that no amount of California sun could warm, adrift from the only world that had ever fully made sense to him, even when it was failing him. And then, on the 5th of February 2024, Buckingham Palace issued a statement that changed the emotional register of the entire story. The king, the statement said, had been diagnosed with a form of cancer. The specific type was not disclosed, though the palace confirmed it was not prostate cancer, which Charles had been treated for the previous month. He would begin a course of treatment and would step back from public-facing duties for a period, though he would continue with state business and official paperwork. The statement was brief, factual, and carried the weight of something the institution rarely confronted openly: the sovereign's mortality. Charles was 75 years old. He had waited longer than any heir in British history to reach the throne, and he had been king for less than 18 months. The direct line was secure: William, then George, then Charlotte, then Louis. But the man at the center of the institution was ill, and illness has a way of dissolving the bureaucratic distance that institutions build between the people trapped inside them. Harry flew to London within hours of the announcement. He went to Clarence's house. He saw his father. The visit lasted approximately 45 minutes. No details were disclosed. The two men had not sat together privately, as far as the public record shows, since the early stages of the departure 4 years earlier. Now they were in the same room because cancer had made the procedural distance suddenly, viscerally insufficient. The question that hung over those 45 minutes, the question the entire country was asking, was whether illness could accomplish what protocol, money, litigation, a memoir, a documentary series, and a global television interview had not: force father and son into the same emotional space long enough to change the ending. Whether those minutes at Clarence's house contained reconciliation, recrimination, or simply the silence of two people who no longer knew how to reach each other, the answer would shape everything that followed. And the answer, as it turned out, was not the one Harry had crossed an ocean to hear. The 45 minutes at Clarence's house did not produce what Harry had crossed an ocean hoping for. The details of the conversation between father and son on that February afternoon have never been publicly disclosed, and the absence of detail is itself informative. In a story where Harry had shown himself willing to narrate private family moments in books, documentaries, and global television interviews, the silence around the cancer visit suggests either that what was said was too painful to share, or that what was said was too little to narrate. What is known is the aftermath. Harry left Clarence's house and returned to his hotel. He did not see William. He did not see other members of the family. He flew back to California the following day. The visit that had briefly, electrically, raised the possibility that mortal illness might accomplish what years of institutional process had not, a genuine reconciliation between the king and his younger son, had lasted less than an hour and had changed nothing visible in the trajectory of the relationship. The institutional distance remained. The personal distance, if anything, had been confirmed. In the weeks that followed, the monarchy's public narrative moved forward without Harry. Charles resumed a modified schedule of public engagements in late April 2024, beginning with a visit to a cancer treatment center in London, a carefully staged return that signaled both the seriousness of the diagnosis and the sovereign's determination to continue. The imagery was deliberate. The king in a dark suit, speaking with patients and medical staff, visibly thinner but visibly present, performing the most fundamental act of monarchy, showing up. The palace's message was clear and calibrated. The king was receiving treatment, the king was working, the institution was functioning. The line of succession was not in jeopardy. The machine had not faltered. William stepped further into the visible center, carrying a greater share of the representational burden while his father was in treatment. Investitures, state visits, the earth-shot prize, the ceremonial work that keeps the crown present in public life. Catherine's situation added a dimension of vulnerability and public sympathy that further tightened the institution's bond with the country. In March 2024, the Princess of Wales revealed that she was undergoing preventative chemotherapy following abdominal surgery in January. The disclosure was handled with the control that had become her hallmark. A personal video message filmed outdoors in which she spoke directly to the public with a composure that was moving precisely because the subject matter was so frightening. Two senior members of the family undergoing cancer treatment simultaneously, and the king and the future queen, created a moment of genuine public concern that had the paradoxical effect of strengthening the monarchy's emotional connection to the nation. People worried about Charles and Catherine in a way that was personal, not merely constitutional, and that worry generated a depth of public affection the institution could not have manufactured. The monarchy was, in illness, performing the version of itself it had always valued most: composed, honest when it needed to be, enduring. Harry's position in this landscape was painfully isolated. His father was ill and would not see him. His sister-in-law was ill, and the relationship with William, that might once have made him a source of comfort, was damaged beyond any quick repair. His brother was shouldering the visible weight of the family's public duties while their father was in treatment, and the contrast between William's presence inside the institution and Harry's absence from it was sharpening with every public engagement William carried out. Harry existed in the news coverage as a peripheral figure, mentioned in connection with the cancer diagnosis, mentioned in connection with the security case, mentioned when he appeared in London for the occasional event, but no longer as a participant in the family's collective life. He was, in media terms, a character in someone else's story rather than a protagonist in his own. He returned to London in May 2024 for the 10th anniversary of the Invictus Games, the event he had founded, the project that was most purely his own, the thing that had nothing to do with inheritance or constitutional position, and everything to do with the man he had chosen to become after Afghanistan. He attended a service at St. Paul's Cathedral on the 8th of May, marking the decade of Invictus with veterans and supporters from across the globe. It was a significant moment in a city where his public appearances had become increasingly rare and increasingly weighted with unspoken tension. He looked at ease among the veterans. He always did. The military world, the camaraderie, the shared understanding of service and sacrifice, the absence of hierarchy based on birth, was the one world in which Harry had always seen most fully himself. The Invictus community did not care whether he was a working royal or a non-working royal. They cared that he had served, that he understood, and that he had built something that changed their lives. But the visit was shadowed by a detail that carried more weight than any ceremony. A spokesperson confirmed that Harry would not be meeting the king during his time in London because of Charles's full schedule. There is something about that sentence worth sitting with. The King of England, Harry's father, was in the same city as his son, and the explanation offered for their not meeting was that the king's diary could not accommodate it. Whether the schedule was genuinely impenetrable or whether the refusal to meet was itself, the message wrapped in administrative language, the effect was identical. The institutional apparatus had placed a diary between a father and son, and the diary had won. Harry attended the Invictus service, performed his public role with the warmth and emotional focus that had always been his particular gift, and returned to California without having seen his father. The pattern was now unmistakable, and it was accelerating. Harry could still come to London, could still appear in public, could still perform the role of the prince who cared about veterans and service. But the private relationship that had once existed behind those public appearances was no longer accessible through normal channels. Access was no longer automatic. The son could not simply arrive and expect the father to be available. The relationship now operated on the institution's terms, and the institution's terms communicated through scheduling rather than confrontation, were that the king was busy. Running parallel to the emotional deterioration, and, in Harry's mind, inseparable from it, was the legal battle that would eventually produce the story's climactic scene. Harry had been fighting in the British court since 2021 over the decision to change his security arrangements when he ceased to be a working royal. The case concerned RAVEC, the Royal and VIP Executive Committee, the Home Office body responsible for determining who in the United Kingdom receives publicly funded police protection. The committee's decisions are not normally public. Its deliberations are not normally reported. The fact that its workings were being examined in open court was itself a measure of how far the royal dispute had moved from family disagreement into constitutional litigation. As a senior working royal, Harry had been part of the regular RAVEC cohort, receiving automatic round-the-clock metropolitan police protection, armed officers, advanced security sweeps, threat monitoring, the permanent infrastructure of safety that surrounds the sovereign and those closest to the sovereign. When his status changed in 2020, his security arrangements changed with it. He was removed from the regular cohort and placed on what the Home Office described as a case-by-case basis, a bespoke arrangement under which his protection would be assessed individually for each UK visit, determined by threat level, itinerary, profile of events attended, and other operational factors. The arrangement meant that Harry could still receive police protection in Britain, but it would no longer be automatic, no longer permanent, and no longer guaranteed in advance. Each visit would be assessed on its merits. Each assessment would be made by RAVEC. The result might be full protection, partial protection, or no publicly funded protection at all, depending on the circumstances. Harry's legal argument was that the change was unlawful, that the decision to downgrade his security had been improperly made, that the process by which RAVEC had reached its conclusion was flawed, and that his personal risk level remained high regardless of his working status. He argued that his profile, his family's profile, and the specific threats documented against him and Meghan meant that anything less than automatic protection left them dangerously exposed. He pointed to specific incidents: attempts to breach security at their California home, online threats, the general climate of hostility, as evidence that the risk was real and ongoing. The case was not for Harry a bureaucratic dispute about the allocation of police resources. It was the legal front of the war he had been fighting since he was 12 years old, since the night his mother died in a tunnel in Paris while being chased by photographers. The argument that the institution owed him safety, that safety should not be conditional on compliance with institutional terms, and that the withdrawal of automatic protection was not an administrative adjustment, but an act that placed his family in danger. He had said publicly more than once that he could not bring Meghan and the children to Britain safely under the current arrangements. The security case was therefore not merely about Harry's ability to visit London for a day or attend a court hearing. It was about Archie and Lilibet, about whether the king's grandchildren, aged 5 and 3, could set foot in the country of their father's birth without their father believing their lives were at risk. The case had moved through the courts slowly, expensively, and with the grinding procedural rhythm that characterizes British administrative law. Harry lost at the High Court in February 2024 when Mr. Justice Lane ruled that the RAVEC decision-making process had been lawful, that there was no evidence of procedural unfairness, and that Harry's challenge did not succeed on its principal grounds. The judge acknowledged Harry's concerns but found that the committee had acted within its authority and had given proper consideration to the relevant factors. Harry appealed. The appeal was heard in the spring of 2025 by the Court of Appeal, 3 senior judges examining whether the lower court had erred in law, and the judgment, delivered on the 2nd of May, would become the setting for the most devastating single day in the entire narrative. The 2nd of May, 2025, a Friday, London under a flat gray sky, the kind of overcast light that makes the city's stone buildings look older and heavier than they do in summer. The Royal Courts of Justice on the Strand, the vast Victorian Gothic building of Portland stone, arched windows and carved decoration, designed by George Edmund Street in the 1870s to house the Superior Courts of England and Wales. The building sits between Fleet Street and the Aldwych, surrounded by the barristers' chambers of the Inns of Court in the heart of legal London. It is not a palace. It is not a ceremonial venue. It is not a place designed to honor royal blood or to cushion the feelings of the families that live inside the constitutional order. It is a place where the state processes its arguments with the impersonal precision of an institution that does not deal in sentiment and the fact that the climax of the royal family's most painful modern rupture took place here, not at Buckingham Palace, not at Windsor Castle, not at Sandringham, not in any setting that carries the warmth of family or the grandeur of monarchy is itself the point. The story had left the realm of the personal and entered the realm of the administrative. The participants were no longer father and son, or king and prince, or even members of the same family. They were the Duke of Sussex and the Secretary of State for the Home Department. The relationship had been reclassified one final time into a case number, a legal citation, and a judgment that would be published on the judiciary's website alongside every other routine decision of the Court of Appeal. The ruling was detailed, methodical, and unambiguous. The court upheld the lower court's finding. The judges determined that when Harry's status changed and when he ceased to be a working royal, there was good reason for him to come out of the regular RAVEC cohort. His security would henceforth be provided on a bespoke, case-by-case basis when he was in the United Kingdom. The arrangement was not irrational. It was not unlawful. It was, in the court's view, a proportionate response to a change in circumstances that Harry himself had initiated. The language of the judgment was the language of administrative law. Measured, precise, stripped of emotion. The judges did not comment on whether Harry was loved or unloved, welcome or unwelcome, valued or expendable. They commented on whether the decision-making process of a government committee had been lawful, and they found that it had. The court acknowledged that Harry's threat level remained a consideration and that he was entitled to appropriate protection when in the UK. But the nature of that protection, its extent, its duration, its specifics, would be determined on a case-by-case basis by RAVEC, not guaranteed as a permanent entitlement by virtue of birth. The prince, who had once walked inside a permanent bubble of metropolitan police protection, now lived in a country where his security, when he visited, would be assessed each time he came and calibrated to the particular risks of the particular visit. What had been automatic was now conditional. What had been guaranteed was now negotiated. The institutional belonging that security represented, the tangible physical expression of the state's recognition that this person mattered enough to protect at all times, had been replaced by a process, and a process, unlike belonging, can be denied. Harry emerged from the Royal Courts of Justice into the grey afternoon. The cameras were waiting outside the main entrance on the Strand, photographers, television crews, reporters, the assembled machinery of a media industry that had been tracking his story for 5 years and showed no sign of losing interest. He was in a dark suit and tie, no uniform, no ceremonial dress, no medals. A man leaving a courthouse, not a state occasion. There was no red carpet, no crowds of well-wishers, no children holding flowers. The pavement outside the Royal Courts of Justice is the same pavement used by every litigant in England, and Harry walked across it like any other person who had just heard a judgment go against him. The car that collected him was black and unremarkable. The security visible around him was present, but different in character from the full royal protection detail that would have surrounded him 5 years earlier. Privately hired, privately funded, arranged and paid for by Harry himself out of the fortune he had built from Diana's inheritance and from the Netflix and publishing deals that had replaced the Duchy of Cornwall's support. He did not speak to the press gathered on the pavement. He did not stop. He got into the car, and the car moved into the traffic on the Strand and merged with the ordinary movement of a London Friday afternoon. The images of that moment, then a prince walking out of a courthouse, alone in every meaningful sense, surrounded by cameras, but speaking to no one, are the visual distillation of everything the narrative has been building toward. Not grandeur, not ceremony, not the balcony of Buckingham Palace, or the nave of Westminster Abbey, or the sunlit lawn of a Windsor wedding. A man in a dark suit on a gray pavement walking to a car. That evening, the BBC broadcast an interview arranged in advance of the judgment, timed to follow whatever the court decided, in which Harry said what the courts could not say and what the palace would not say. He spoke not as a litigant, but as a son. He spoke not from a legal brief, but from the place where he had always been most exposed, the intersection of family feeling and institutional reality. He said he wanted reconciliation with his father. He said the king would not speak to him, that Charles had refused to engage in conversation while the security case was before the courts, and that Harry hoped, now that the legal proceedings had concluded, that a door to genuine dialogue might finally open. He described the security situation not in legal language, but in the language of fatherhood. He said he could not imagine bringing Meghan and the children back to the United Kingdom safely under the current arrangements. He said it not with anger, not with the performative defiance of the Oprah interview or the calculated disclosure of the memoir, but with a particular kind of weariness, the flat, drained tone of a man who has been making the same argument through every available channel for half a decade and has watched every avenue close in sequence. The courts had closed, the palace had closed, the family had closed, and still he sat there, on camera, saying the same thing he had been saying since 2020. I want to come home, and I cannot come home safely. That sentence about bringing his children home was the single most devastating line in the entire story, and it deserves to be understood in its full weight. A prince of the blood, the son of the reigning king, the grandson of the woman who reigned for 70 years, was telling the national broadcaster of the United Kingdom that he could not safely bring his wife and children to visit the country of his father's birth and his grandmother's burial. Archie was 5 years old. Lilibet was 3. They had spent virtually their entire conscious lives in Montecito, California. They had barely, if ever, experienced the country they were constitutionally part of, the country where their father grew up, where their grandfather was king, where their great-grandmother had reigned from before their father was born. Harry was not saying they were unwelcome. He was saying they were unsafe, that the security arrangements the British state had seen fit to provide for the grandchildren of the sovereign were, in his assessment, insufficient to protect them. Whether that assessment was proportionate or excessive, clear-eyed or clouded by the wound his mother's death had left, the emotional force of the statement was beyond dispute. A father was saying he could not take his children home. And the country that was home, the country whose anthem asked God to save the king, Harry's father, had answered through its courts that the arrangements were lawful and the matter was closed. Buckingham Palace responded the same day, and the response completed the triptych. The statement was a single sentence. It said the issues raised by the Duke of Sussex had been examined repeatedly and meticulously by the courts. That was all. No warmth, no acknowledgement of the family dimension, no expression of regret, of hope, of shared sorrow, no mention of Harry by his first name, no mention of Archie or Lilibet, the grandchildren the king had seen only a handful of times. One sentence, written in the institutional passive voice, referring to the Duke of Sussex as if he were any litigant rather than the sovereign's son, citing the courts rather than the family, and closing the subject with the finality of a filing cabinet being shut and locked. The institution had spoken, and the institution had said the process has been followed, the judiciary has ruled, and there is nothing further to be discussed from our side. The father had not spoken. The king had not spoken. The institution had spoken on their shared behalf, in a voice that belonged to neither man but to the machinery they both served. And the machinery's voice contained no space for the son, the grief, the estrangement, or the children growing up 5,000 miles away. That day, on the 2nd of May, 2025, must be understood as the story's climactic convergence, because every register of the narrative meets in it. Consider the three languages spoken on a single day about a single family. Morning, the Court of Appeals language, citations, precedent, administrative law, the words good reason and bespoke arrangement, and stepping in and out of the cohort and proportionate. It is the language of a legal system that has classified a prince as a manageable administrative category, a person whose relationship with the state's protective apparatus is governed not by who he is, but by what he does. And what he does since January 2020 is nothing on behalf of the institution. Afternoon. Harry's language, human, raw, personal. The language of a son talking about his father and his children, about safety and silence and doors that will not open. It is the language of a man who still wants what the institution cannot give him. Unconditional belonging, the kind of belonging that does not depend on working royal status or court rulings or bespoke security assessments, but on the simple fact of being a member of a family. Evening. The palace's language, one sentence, institutional terminal, a line drawn under a subject that the institution considers resolved. It is the language of a monarchy that has learned across nearly a century of practice that survival requires the ability to close a subject, absorb the criticism, and carry on. The point of the climax is not that Charles personally scripted every outcome, or that he sat in his study at Buckingham Palace drafting the one-sentence response. The point is that by this stage in the story, the monarchy no longer needed Charles to intervene personally at all. The operating system did the work. The courts processed the case according to administrative law. Ravik processed the security according to its protocols. The Palace Communications Office processed the public response according to institutional convention. The prince was processed through the legal system, through the security apparatus, through the media cycle, and the institution, having processed him, turned its attention to the next engagement on the sovereign's calendar. That is not cruelty in the way cruelty is normally understood. It is something harder to name and harder to fight. The impersonal efficiency of a system that has been designed over centuries to protect the line of succession above every competing claim, including the claim of a son who wants his father to pick up the telephone. The immediate aftermath of the 2nd of May was not a family crisis in any recognizable sense. It was not an emergency telephone call, or a rushed meeting, or a tearful confrontation at a kitchen table. It was silence. The particular kind of institutional silence that the House of Windsor deploys not as an absence, but as a strategy. The palace had spoken its sentence and closed the file. Harry had spoken his piece to the BBC, returned to his hotel in London, and within days was back in California. William made no public comment. Catherine made no public comment. Charles made no public comment beyond the institutional statement issued in his name by Buckingham Palace. The family's collective response to the most emotionally exposed moment in its recent public history was the absence of response, a void where a human reaction should have been, filled instead by the steady, undisturbed hum of the institution continuing its daily operations. The king's schedule the following week included engagements, audiences, and state business. The Prince of Wales attended public events. The machinery turned. The subject was closed. In the days and weeks that followed, the British press dissected the judgment and the interview with the thoroughness of an industry that had been covering this story for half a decade and showed no sign of exhaustion. The legal analysis was straightforward and confirmed what the judgment said. Harry had lost, the Ravik decision was lawful, the bespoke arrangement would stand, and the prospects for further appeal was slim. The human analysis, the editorials, the opinion columns, the broadcast discussions, the social media debates was more divided and more painful. One school of commentary held that Harry had breathed this outcome upon himself, that the memoir, the interviews, the Netflix series, and the relentless public narration of private grievance had burned every bridge the family might have used to bring him back into the fold. Another school held that the institution's coldness was the root cause, that a father who would not speak to his son over a legal dispute about the safety of his grandchildren had chosen the crown over the child and the bureaucratic over the human. Both arguments contained truth. Neither contained the whole truth. The whole truth, if such a thing exists in a story this layered, this long, and this painful, was that the monarchy's operating logic and Harry's emotional needs had been on a collision course since the moment he was born to spare. Since the August morning his mother died, since the day he fell in love with a woman, the institution could not absorb on the terms she required. The collision had finally produced a wreckage that neither side knew how to clear, and neither side, as far as the public could see, was willing to be the first to reach into it. Harry remained, after the 2nd of May, exactly what he had been before it: a prince, a duke, a husband, a father, a man in the line of succession to the British throne. He remained fifth in line behind William, George, Charlotte, and Louis. He remained the Duke of Sussex, a title granted by his grandmother on the morning of his wedding, a title that once carried the promise of a life inside the institution, and now carried only the echo of that promise. His blood had not changed. His legal status had not changed. His place in the constitutional architecture had not shifted by a single position. What had changed, and what the judgment and the interview and the palace's single sentence had made undeniably, publicly, irreversibly clear, was that the infrastructure which had once given those facts their practical meaning had been entirely withdrawn. He was a prince without a role, a duke without a residence in his own country, a decorated soldier without a military commission, a royal without state-funded security, a son without reliable access to his father. The titles remain. The substance behind them, the duties, the funding, the protection, the residence, the patronages, the daily operational belonging that made a prince a working part of the monarchy, rather than a name on a genealogical chart, was gone. And the institution that had removed that substance, piece by piece, across 5 years of administrative precision, would continue tomorrow to operate exactly as it had operated today, because that is what institutions do. They endure, they carry on. The question that remained, and the only question worth carrying into the final chapter of this story, was what, if anything, was left when the institution had finished carrying on without him. What was left in the weeks and months after the 2nd of May was not nothing, but it was not what anyone involved, not Harry, not Charles, not the institution, not the millions of people around the world who had followed this story through its every public convulsion, would have chosen as the ending. What was left was the particular kind of aftermath that the House of Windsor specializes in producing, a family that remains technically intact while the practical bonds that once held it together have been withdrawn one by one until the connection exists only on paper and in the memories of the people who remember when it was real. Charles continued as king. His cancer treatment was ongoing through 2025, and the palace disclosed periodic updates that were calibrated to reassure the public without revealing more than the institution wished to be known. The type of cancer was never specified, beyond confirming it was not the prostate condition initially treated. The prognosis was not publicly discussed, and the treatment schedule was described only in terms of its impact on the sovereign's official diary. He returned to a fuller program of public engagements in stages, appearing at state occasions, hosting investitures at Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle, receiving foreign heads of state, attending the cenotaph on Remembrance Sunday, and carrying out the constitutional duties that define the sovereign's role. The weekly audience with the Prime Minister, the approval of legislation, the reading of the daily red boxes of state papers. He looked thinner than he had before the diagnosis. His face carried a new austerity, but the thinness gave him a gravity that suited the office. And the image of a king continuing to serve despite illness generated a public respect that was, in its way, a vindication of the Windsor model, the model that says the institution matters more than the person inside it, that the work goes on regardless of what the body endures. He was determined by every credible account to reign actively, to use whatever time he had on the throne to shape the monarchy's future, rather than merely to maintain its present. The institution around him functioned with the efficiency that Elizabeth's 70-year stewardship had embedded into its daily rhythm. The Privy Council met, the red boxes arrived, the Lord Chamberlain's office processed the engagements. The crown endured, as it had always endured, because endurance was the point. William and Catherine occupied the position the institution had been preparing them for since the day they married, the visible, emotional center of the monarchy's future. William, as Prince of Wales and heir to the throne, carried a workload that had expanded significantly since his father's illness and his brother's departure. He attended state events, led charitable initiatives through the Earthshot Prize and the Royal Foundation, represented the crown on overseas visits, and performed the steady, visible, unspectacular work of a man who understood that the monarchy's survival depended not on glamour, but on presence. Catherine, having completed her own cancer treatment and returned to public life in the latter half of 2024, was beside him. At Trooping the Color, at Christmas at Sandringham, at the carefully staged family appearances that communicated continuity and warmth. Their children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, appeared at public events with the frequency and naturalness that signaled to anyone paying attention that the next generation of the monarchy was being prepared not merely constitutionally, but emotionally. The line of succession was not an abstraction. It was three children walking through a palace gate, waving at cameras, being shaped from the earliest age by the disciplines that the institution demanded and that Harry, a generation earlier, had found unbearable. The contrast with Harry's position was total, and for anyone with a sense of the story's full arc, painful to contemplate. Harry remained in Montecito with Meghan, Archie, and Lilibet. He was 40 years old and he lived in a 9-bedroom house on 7 acres of landscaped grounds in one of the wealthiest communities in California, surrounded by the infrastructure of American celebrity, the private security, the gated neighborhood, the proximity to other famous residents that had replaced the infrastructure of British royalty he had left behind. His charitable operation had been restructured. The umbrella organization was now known as Archewell Philanthropies, and its work continued in areas including mental health advocacy, veterans' welfare, and children's digital safety. The Invictus Games remained his most significant independent achievement, and the movement had grown into something genuinely important, an international competition that had changed the lives of thousands of wounded veterans and that continued to provide Harry with the sense of purpose, service, and community that the institution had once supplied through official duties and then withdrawn when those duties were removed. But 2025 also brought a loss that complicated any version of the story in which departure from the monarchy equaled peace. Harry resigned as patron of Centabal, the charity he had co-founded in 2006 with Prince Siso of Lesotho, working with children and young people affected by HIV and AIDS in southern Africa. The charity had been named after a forget-me-not flower. Centabale means forget-me-not in Sesotho, and Harry had described it publicly as one of the projects closest to his heart. A continuation of Diana's legacy of AIDS work, a connection to the African landscape where he had always felt most free. The resignation followed a reported dispute over the charity's leadership, governance, and direction, and whatever the specific details, and which were not fully disclosed, the departure carried a particular weight because Centabale was one of the last organizational connections between Harry's present life and the charitable identity he had built while still a working member of the royal family. It was founded before Meghan, before Invictus, before California. It was rooted in Diana's memory. And now it was gone, severed not by the institution, but by the ordinary dispiriting mechanics of organizational disagreement. Harry was learning, as anyone who leaves a large institution eventually learns, that the world outside the palace had its own capacity for rupture, its own politics, its own disappointments. The monarchy did not hold a monopoly on things falling apart. Meghan's trajectory was its own story, adjacent to Harry's, but distinct in its pressures and its public reception. She had pivoted from the Sussex royal era into a series of commercial and creative ventures in the Netflix content deal, the Spotify podcast, a lifestyle brand, a cooking and entertaining project in development. The media coverage of her post-royal life oscillated between admiration for her entrepreneurial ambition and skepticism about the commercial model's long-term sustainability. The Spotify partnership had ended in 2023. The Netflix relationship continued, but without the volume of content that the initial deal had seemed to promise. The challenge she faced was structural and, in its own way, as unforgiving as the one Harry faced. Her public identity remained tethered to the royal connection, and every new venture was assessed not on its own merits, but through the lens of the departure. She was, like Harry, free. And like Harry, she was discovering that freedom from the institution did not automatically produce freedom to build something the world would value on entirely new terms. The royal story followed them both. It was the source of their commercial relevance, the engine of public fascination, and the shadow from which neither of them could fully step. The institution itself had undergone the quiet administrative consolidation that invariably follows a departure in the Windsor system. The Councillors of State Act 2022 had added Princess Anne and the Duke of Edinburgh, Edward, to the pool of royals who could act on behalf of the sovereign during incapacity or absence abroad. The practical effect was to ensure that the councillors available to serve were active, present, working royals, rather than members who had left the operational corps or, in Andrew's case, been retired from public duties under different circumstances. Harry remained, by descent and statute, within the original councillor framework, the spouse of the sovereign and the next 4 adults in the line of succession. But the addition of Anne and Edward meant the institution was no longer dependent on his availability or willingness to serve. The system had routed around him with the administrative efficiency it brought to everything. His name remained in the constitutional paperwork. His function within it had been replaced. The machinery did not need him, and the machinery, having determined it did not need him, had ensured it would not miss him. The royal website, royal.uk, still maintained a page for the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. It was a single page, factual and brief, stating that they had stepped back as working members of the royal family in January 2020 and directing visitors to sussex.com for information about their current activities. That page is, in its quiet way, one of the most revealing artifacts of the entire story. It exists, it is not hostile. It does not erase Harry and Meghan from the family's digital presence, but it does what the institution has done at every stage of this narrative. It acknowledges the connection and redirects the inquiry elsewhere, still part of the family, no longer part of the operation. Please visit their own website for details. It is managed distance encoded in HTML, the 21st century equivalent of the Duke of Windsor's forwarding address in Paris. The cultural afterlife of this story is vast, and it must be understood not as an appendix to the events, but as a central dimension of them. Because the Sussex conflict has been not merely reported but serialized across the dominant media forms of its era in a way that has fundamentally reshaped how the public understands both the specific events and the monarchy itself. No previous royal crisis has been documented, dramatized, and commercially distributed on this scale, and the effect has been to make the private life of the royal family a form of public property in a way that would have been inconceivable even a generation earlier. The Oprah interview in March 2021, watched by an estimated 17 million Americans on the night of broadcast and by tens of millions more worldwide in the days and weeks that followed, was the first major act of this cultural transformation. It converted private royal grievance into prestige television and established the interpretive framework through which millions would understand every subsequent development. The institution as antagonist, the individual as truth-teller, duty versus authenticity, the coded silences of the palace versus the emotional directness of the garden interview. It was, in media terms, the moment when the story became global property rather than a British domestic matter. Netflix's Harry and Meghan, released in 6 episodes across December 2022, offered the couple's own documentary account of their courtship, their experience inside the institution, and their departure. The series was intimate and first-person, home video footage, personal photographs, direct-to-camera testimony, and it functioned as a deliberate counter-narrative to the institutional version of events. What the palace had presented as a private family matter handled with care, The series presented as a systemic failure to protect two people who had trusted the institution with their lives. The production reached audiences across more than 190 countries through Netflix's global platform, and the institution had no equivalent channel through which to offer its own account. The asymmetry of media power, the couple commanding a streaming platform with hundreds of millions of subscribers while the palace relied on press statements issued to royal correspondents, was itself a marker of how fundamentally the landscape had shifted. Spare, published in January 2023, pushed the disclosure further still into a 416-page literary memoir that became the fastest-selling nonfiction book in British publishing history. The book's revelations, the physical altercation with William, the financial disputes with Charles, the killing count in Afghanistan, the private moments of grief and anger and love entered the cultural bloodstream permanently. Unlike a television interview, which fades from memory as the news cycle turns, a published book endures. It sits on shelves. It is quoted in other works. It becomes a primary source for future historians and biographers. Spare ensured that Harry's version of events would be preserved in permanent, widely accessible form, regardless of what the institution chose to say or not say in response. And around these primary productions, the broader cultural machine continued to process the Windsor story through other lenses. The Crown, Netflix's dramatization of Elizabeth II's reign across 6 seasons and 73 episodes, had not directly depicted the Sussex departure, but it had embedded in the global imagination a grammar for understanding the royal family. The tension between duty and desire, the crushing weight of the institution, the pattern of emotional repression followed by crisis, the recurring motif of a family member choosing personal happiness and paying the institutional price. The show's audience numbered in the hundreds of millions, and its depiction of earlier Windsor crises, Edward and Wallis, Margaret and Townsend, Charles and Diana, gave viewers a template through which the Harry story felt not like an anomaly, but like an inevitability, the latest iteration of a pattern the family had been running since before most of its audience was born. The line between the fictional Windsors and the real Windsors blurred in public consciousness, and that blurring was a form of cultural power the institution could neither harness nor resist. The monarchy's story was no longer told solely by the monarchy or by the British press. It was told by streaming services, publishers, podcasters, social media, and a global audience that felt, by virtue of having consumed these productions, a proprietary relationship with the family's interior life. The institution that had survived for centuries by controlling its own narrative had lost that control, and the loss was permanent. What remains, as of the spring of 2026, is a monarchy that has contracted and a prince who has been contracted away, and neither the contraction nor its human consequences show any sign of resolution. Charles is 77 years old. He is king of the United Kingdom and the other Commonwealth realms. He continues to receive treatment for cancer, and the palace provides updates on his health at intervals the institution determines. He carries out official duties with the discipline that a lifetime of preparation instilled. Audiences, investitures, state visits, the constitutional business of sovereignty. And he does so with a visible determination that has earned public admiration. He has not spoken publicly about his younger son since the single-sentence palace statement of May 2025. Whether he has spoken privately, whether there have been telephone calls, text messages, letters, or any form of direct communication between father and son in the months since, it is not part of the public record. What is part of the public record is the silence, and the silence speaks in the language the institution has always preferred. William is 43. He is Prince of Wales, Duke of Cornwall and Cambridge, and heir to the throne. He carries a public workload that has expanded steadily since his father's illness and his brother's departure. State events, overseas visits, the Earthshot Prize, the Royal Foundation, and the representational duties that keep the crown visible in the national life. Catherine is 44. She returned to full public duties in the latter half of 2024 after completing her preventative chemotherapy, and her composure during the most difficult year of her public life deepened the public's attachment to her in ways that no amount of institutional planning could have engineered. They live with their children at Adelaide Cottage on the Windsor estate and at apartment 1A, Kensington Palace. George is 12 and has begun to appear at public events with the quiet confidence of a child who is being gently introduced to the role that awaits him. Charlotte is 11. Louis is 8. The three children represent, in constitutional terms, the next three positions in the line of succession after their father. The institution's future is extraordinarily secure. Three healthy children, a stable partnership, a father who has accepted the system's demands, and a mother who has navigated its pressures with a grace that the institution values above almost every other quality. The working monarchy is smaller, tighter, and more focused than it has been in decades, and the focus is deliberate. Princess Anne, at 75, continues to carry out more public engagements than any other member of the family. The Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh, Edward and Sophie, serve with quiet reliability. The working core functions. It does not miss the members who have left it. Harry is 41. He lives in Montecito, California, with Meghan, who is 44, and their two children. Archie is 6 years old. Lilibet is 4. They are the king's grandchildren. They are fifth and sixth in the line of succession to the British throne. They have spent virtually their entire conscious lives in the United States, in a gated estate in Santa Barbara County, speaking with American accents, attending American schools, growing up in a culture where their father's title is a curiosity rather than a constitution. Harry remains the Duke of Sussex. He remains in the line of succession, where he has sat since the day of his birth, behind his brother and his brother's three children. He remains, in law and in the constitutional architecture, a member of the royal family. He remains, in every practical and operational sense, outside it. The estate that once housed him, Frogmore Cottage on the Windsor estate, the house where he and Meghan began their married life, the house where Archie spent his earliest months, the house whose renovation Harry repaid in full, has been reassigned to another member of the family. The military titles that once connected him to the armed forces he served for a decade, Captain General of the Royal Marines, Honorary Air Commandant of RAF Huntington, Commodore-in-Chief of the Royal Naval Command's small ships and diving, have been redistributed among working royals. The patronages that once linked him to the nation's civic and cultural life, the National Theatre, the Association of Commonwealth Universities, the Queen's Commonwealth Trust, the Rugby Football Union, the Rugby Football League, have been returned to the institution and reallocated. The Duchy of Cornwall income that once funded his official existence now flows to William. The publicly funded security that once surrounded him at every moment of every day is now provided. When it is provided at all, on a case-by-case basis, determined by a committee whose decisions he challenged through 2 levels of the British judiciary and lost. The royal.uk page that bears his name directs visitors to a different website. The institution that raised him celebrated his wedding before a global audience of nearly 2 billion people and announced his children's births to the world, now manages his public existence with the careful, neutral, procedurally impeccable distance that it has applied across nearly a century to every member of the family whose private choices place them outside the working core. The distance is not hostile. It is not punitive in its language. It is simply administrative, and that is what makes it so complete. The absence of those who shaped this story is felt most acutely in its present tense. Diana is 28 years dead, killed in Paris at 36, the same age Harry is now past by 5 years, a mother who never saw her grandchildren, a woman whose death created the wound that this entire narrative has been tracing through its consequences. Elizabeth is 3 years dead, the longest reigning monarch in British history, the grandmother who loved Harry, who found him funny, who understood the burden of being constitutionally unnecessary, and whose authority was the last force capable of holding the family's contradictions in something like balance. The two women who might have softened the ending, the mother whose emotional honesty Harry inherited and the grandmother whose institutional wisdom he needed, are gone. What remains is a system operating without their moderating presence, and a man navigating his middle years without the two people who understood both him and the institution well enough to stand in the narrowing space between them. No one has replaced them in that role. No one can. The space they occupied was not a position that could be filled by appointment. It was a function of who they were, and they are not here. The public saw one version of this family: the cameras at the wedding, the photographs on the balcony, the Christmas Day walk to church, the choreographed unity of a monarchy that presented itself as both extraordinary and recognizable. The private version is more human, more complicated, and more painful than the public version ever allowed. It is the story of a dynasty that does not destroy by banishing. It survives, if survive is the right word for what the people inside it experience, by reducing, by reclassifying, by withdrawing the operational infrastructure that gives royal identity its daily meaning, while leaving the titles, the bloodline, and the constitutional connection intact in law and in name. Edward, they thought, was the hard version of this method: abdication, exile, a life spent permanently outside the gates. Harry is the soft version: no abdication, no act of parliament, no formal severance, just a slow, procedural, administratively correct removal of every mechanism that once made a prince a functioning part of the monarchy he was born into. The family feeling never quite disappears. Official statements still call the Sussexes much loved members of the family. But the modern British monarchy is built to preserve the sovereign and the heir above every competing emotional claim. And in this story, the competing claim belonged to a second son who wanted protection without erasure, family without submission, and a place inside the institution that did not require him to surrender the right to speak. Harry, the prince, who as a 12-year-old boy walked behind his mother's coffin through London, watched by millions, performing a grief he could not yet fully comprehend, reaches his early 40s in a house on the California coast, saying he cannot safely bring his own children to the country where that grief first took root inside him. That is not a lesson. That is not a moral about the price of rebellion or the necessity of duty. It is just the most painful rhyme in the story. The echo across 28 years of a boy who lost his mother to the collision between royal life and public danger, and a man who lost his place in the family to the collision between royal logic and private need.